So many of the most famous faces in our society today. You saw the pictures in that intro. Good evening. I'm John McKay. We're talking, of course, tonight about sexual harassment. We'll be talking about this for the next 30 minutes. Joining me to my left side is our digital journalist, Alicia Ibrahimji. She will be taking any kind of questions that you may have, concerns about what you're going to be hearing from our panelists tonight. Also, WFA senior reporter Rebecca Lopez is here as well tonight. She's going to be talking. She's done extensive reporting with regard to these issues in terms of the athletes, the professional athletes. We've done a number of stories on this. We expect to be joined momentarily by someone from the Dallas Area Rape Crisis Center. Beth Jones is with us tonight also. She's a human resources expert, been in human resources for quite some time. And Joanna Grossman, who was at the SMU Dedman School of Law, she has been writing extensively on this for years, and she joins us also tonight. Joanna, I really want to start with you. This is now something that every day you wake up, and it's not something new, but someone new, and someone very famous. What makes now different from 10 years ago, 5 years ago?
Well, the harassment is not new, right? What's new is the consequences, and what's new is that people are coming forward. So you could look at harassment, we could document it in all different contexts for the beginning of time, and we can document it in this country as having a name and a face and a movement dating to about the late 1970s. But through most of that time, it's been something that, by and large, harassers have gotten away with. There's been very little accountability and very little willingness by victims to come forward. But now we have this moment where there are consequences, and that is encouraging people to come forward. And that's what gives rise to this feeling that every single day you're going to wake up and find out who it is now. It's the consequences, not the harassment.
Is it fair to say that the fact that so many well-known people are involved in this, that this gives us some indication of just how widespread this is in society?
It's certainly information to that effect, but we already knew that, right? Mm-hmm. So if you look at surveys, data, cases, anecdotal stories, and every resource we have, we know that sexual harassment is pervasive. We know that it's common. We know that it happens in every sector, in every industry, at every level of the occupational spectrum. So the fact that these scandals are coming out from different places is a good reminder of that, but we already knew that.
Beth, let me ask you, you've been involved in human resources for years. You seeing more reports now than a few years ago?
Absolutely. The fear factor is much, much smaller than it used to be. So in the past, the victim became further victimized when they reported sexual harassment. Not always, but many, many times. And the person who was offending them was a person in power. So their livelihood, their job, their promotion, whatever was dependent upon that person. So there was a consequence to them as a victim as opposed to the person doing the harassment.
Okay, well, Rebecca, let me ask you this. I know you have done quite a few stories for us here at Channel 8 about accusations of sexual harassment, actual cases of sexual harassment, the difficulties that people have had in trying to convince the rest of us that something really did occur. Are you finding a number of calls coming into your desk? Has that increased, the number of people who've...
Absolutely. I'm amazed, and I think it's an enlightening moment in our society right now that so many women are feeling empowered and they're finally ready to speak out. And I think it's a lot like domestic violence was, where nobody wanted to talk about it. It was kind of that dirty little secret nobody talked about, but now women feel empowered to speak out. And even this Friday, there's going to be a protest out at R. Kelly's a concert on Friday because he has had all kinds of allegations of sexual misconduct with young girls and sexual harassment, and women are starting to speak out and protest more now. I think the next step is there's still a long way to go because we seem to still excuse some behavior by some people like athletes and by some not just R&B singers, but performers, like, well, it's boys will be boys, or that's just part of the culture. But I think that more and more women are starting to speak up, and I hope that this will now resonate where we hold everyone accountable, not just the politicians or those in the entertainment industry, but that it goes more widespread.
Well, let me ask, and this goes to everybody here. This goes beyond culture, it goes beyond age, it goes beyond anything. This is a problem, it seems to me, that's based quite clearly on gender and power. Any thoughts about that?
Absolutely. We were having a brief conversation earlier. I've been getting questions about, is this something that women do as well? Or are we going to be hearing about women who are harassing people of whatever gender who report to them or work with them? And the truth is that, yes, those cases do exist. As we discussed, they're a very small percentage in comparison to what we're seeing in the media today. But we very well may see someone come out with a complaint against a woman. And I think that it's one of those things that this is a societal trend. It's a shifting in our culture and in our awareness and in our response, or the way that we react when something does happen to us as victims.
But even if you look at the responses, you see this deeper gender divide, right? So, in some cases, some of these men who have had allegations by dozens, in some cases even over 100 women, the immediate response is still, they're all lying, right? And the president has been accused of harassment. He says they're all liars, and his spokespeople say that. Hollywood moguls say they're all lying. And that is a trope as old as time, right? That women who cry rape or sexual harassment, they're the problem. So that's one of the things you see. This is just a symptom of that deeper problem. And we have this sense now that every man who ever did anything is going to be held accountable and maybe over accountable. But that's not been the history at all, right? The history has been that these problems have been ignored, that women have been ignored, and that women who've come forward have really suffered for that. So we have to, it's not enough to have the watershed moment, it's all about how you react to it. If we don't seize this opportunity and change our institutions and try to work towards real attitudinal and cultural change, then this will pass and nothing will be better. You have to really act on it.
Are we going to see changes in terms of criminal law and civil law, you think? More aggressive prosecution, more people aware of what's going on when people come into their offices?
Yeah, I think it's going to be in different ways. So one thing that there's certainly been a lot of talk about is the role of non-disclosure agreements, so-called gag rules. Really the first scandal that started all of this were the ones at Fox News last fall. And those revealed that a big part of the reason why both Roger Ailes
and Bill O'Reilly.
Blocked his name out. Why they were unable to do this for so long is that they were paying off victims, and Fox News was paying off victims. They were personally paying off victims, and then having them sign agreements in which they agreed to never speak of it again. And that has turned out to be true in a lot of these other, with a lot of these other men as well. So a lot of legislatures already, I know I've been contacted by several to work on them, are busy thinking about, could we change the law to say that you actually can't have a gag rule in a contract settling a case like this. Whether that will happen, I don't know, but that's certainly one legal response that makes sense given the way these problems have gone on for years.
Well, and the laws have already changed in Texas when it comes to, and in other states when it comes to sex assault, because now there is no statute of limitations. So if there is a sex assault that happens there was an outcry, say 5 years ago, now you can still be prosecuted for those. And in the past, that wasn't the case. There was a statute of limitations, I think, of 25 years, but that changed.
Well, let me ask you, while I realize that with criminal law, there would have been limitations that have now changed, should that even be an issue if it was 40 years ago? So-and-so years ago, because the fact that society has changed, shouldn't those, not necessarily their criminal charges, but the complaints, shouldn't they be held as just as important even if they are 40 years old, because the woman has finally decided to come forward?
I think so, because I've talked to so many women about this, and women that have called me, and no one, A, believed women, like you said, and B, everyone was afraid to speak out. You were afraid to lose your career, or you were afraid of the victim shaming, or what did you do to deserve this? How did you dress? What did you do? And I think that, you know, women now are feeling more comfortable about coming forward and talking about what happened, and that goes in everything from sexual harassment to sexual abuse. And so I do believe that those people should still be held accountable, because for a long time women were silenced and there was this victim shaming, and now that we are more empowered to speak up, I do believe that those people that sexually assaulted someone should be held criminally accountable, even if it was 40 years ago. It happened.
Right. A lot of the response, which I find sort of curious in some of these recent allegations, this sort of, oh, I didn't realize it was bad, now I know, and I'm going to go to therapy and try to make it better.
Right.
But the truth is, most of these, the earliest these allegations for these particular men are in the news go back as about the 1970s. The 1970s is not the 1920s, right? The 1970s was the civil rights, the tail end of the civil rights movement. It was the women's rights movement. It was Title VII. It was people starting to talk about sexual harassment for the first time. And what we know from research about how people perceive harassment is there's actually very little disagreement between men and women about, on the severe end of the spectrum, if you give them a vignette and say, is this count as sexual harassment? They all say yes. And if you get things that are a little closer to ambiguous, they all say yes. If you get to ambiguous, a few more women will say yes than men. But this idea that there's some huge gap, that there are really these men who didn't realize that touching people, raping people, making people watch them masturbate, that somehow there was a period of time since the 1970s when they didn't know that was wrong.
Correct.
And they feel bad in retrospect, but it's just not a very credible kind of a claim. And given, as we just heard, all the reasons why women didn't come forward, you can hardly penalize them at this point for having stayed silent.
Should these, you were talking about these kind of gag orders that people have to sign. Well, I guess they don't have to, but unless they want the job.
The settlement won't be offered without them.
Well, I was going to say, won't be. So isn't there some? So I think it's going to take legislation then to try to keep that from continuing on as a process. Yes,
and there is actually a cost. If you think about, you know, a current victim who's negotiating, say, with an employer over misconduct, that victim is actually better off in a lot of ways by being able to have a contract with a non-disclosure agreement, because it might increase the likelihood that the employer will settle. It might increase the amount of money that she gets. So eliminating that possibility, we're sort of picking future victims over the current victim, which I think on balance, given what we've seen, is the right thing to do. But there is a cost that comes with, if we were to have legislation that said these clauses are just illegal. It is part of what makes settlements happen, is the employer says, I can move on, I cannot have reputational harm, I cannot have advertisers leave, I cannot suffer any of those consequences because I'm paying for it, but I'm also hiding it. You know, on balance, as I said, I don't think public policy supports its use in this area given how we've seen the abuse, but it's not costless.
But you also have a situation, if you are the employer and you want to retain and attract the best talent, to have a culture that doesn't require that kind of thing is a real benefit to the organization, because it sends a message to those people that you want to attract and keep. We are a fair employer. We don't have a culture like that. We won't ask you to sign things that you don't want to sign. And so I think that when you get into the corporate arena, that makes a big difference. And I hear it all the time from clients that they want desperately to attract those really top people and keep them in their companies. And they fight over good talent. And so this is a bargaining chip.
Well, Alicia, you've been watching what people are saying to us online. What are you hearing from them?
Yeah, we have a large amount of people in this conversation just kind of making comments and asking questions. So Elizabeth is asking, she's been through this, she's reported it, and nothing has happened. You know, a lot of times now we're seeing all this because these are high profile people that we're talking about. So what can your average, you know, Joe Schmo, I guess you could say, do about this kind of thing?
the first thing that they should do is say, no, don't do that. I don't want that. I don't want you to do that to me. So they need to make it clear to that person who's victimizing them to stop. The second thing that they need to do is to report it. If the first person they report it to doesn't do anything, report it to somebody else. So if you report it to your boss and they don't do anything, report it to one of their peers, somebody else who's in a leadership position in the organization. Report it to your human resources department. If you don't have one, then you can look outside. Where can you find strength in numbers? Are there other people in the organization that are being victimized as well? Can you rally them together? Are there witnesses? Are there people who know that this is going on? So when your voice gets louder, it's a whole lot more difficult to ignore.
Taking notes, I assume the whole time you're doing this as well. Notes that you probably want to keep to yourself. Notes about what happened, what day it happened, who the person was, who I contacted.
In this day and age with iPhones, record it.
Yeah.
Who else are you hearing from?
A lot of different comments here. Let's see. Here we go. Melanie saying, I think the problem has a lot to do with the power these men and women have in the entertainment industry and politics. Maybe we can talk a little bit about that. Just touching on, what we just talked about.
It's power everywhere.
Yeah.
The same thing exists in any corporate situation. There's always a boss. Somebody is a boss's boss or a direct boss. Power does corrupt. So people have sometimes a sense of entitlement. To your point, yes, they know it's wrong. It isn't about knowing that it's right or wrong. It's, I think I can get away with it. That's the mentality that we need to fight and shift. So it isn't exclusive to people who are high profile. It exists everywhere within all different stratas of the society.
Well, and if you look at Congress and the people and the legislatures that are writing the laws that would strengthen it, so it would strengthen it so that people could come forward and more people would be held accountable. They're men. It's men that have been leading the way in politics. So that's why you don't have some of the stronger legislation that women have needed
Is it not
to put some real teeth in the laws.
Is it not also the Congress? I think I read something that said that there were some non-disclosure materials that people who worked in Congress had to sign or something like that. So we're talking about the lawmakers themselves who tried to protect themselves.
There's a fund in all these legislatures that pays off victims, and sometimes it comes out and sometimes it doesn't, but it's a regular part of doing business. Is there going to be some complaints, there's going to be some misconduct, and we'll just brush it under the rug. But I want to talk a little bit also about the power point, because power comes in a lot of different forms, right? One of the most harassed most harassed employees are waitresses. And the power is because they work for tips. And the power is that they have managers the managers might not be doing the harassing, it's often the customers. But they're put in a situation where you need to make the customer happy, and the whole culture is the customer is right, and you need to put up with this, and you need to let them touch you or hit you on the butt or whatever it is. So it's not always, all of these stories involve not just people who are supervisors who have power, it's the top person at each place, right? Which is actually relatively unusual. Not that those people never harass, but for every story we're seeing, to be the single most powerful person, right? Matt Lauer is the single highest paid person at NBC News. Harvey Weinstein owns the company. Roger Ailes is the CEO of Fox News. That's different, and it might make us miss what's happening every day, every place, every workplace, where there's no big money maker, there's no big rainmaker. It's just the ordinary cost of having a job.
And I can tell you from having covered sports and being in locker rooms, and I've talked to a lot of the female journalists that have covered sports, the sports journalists, and how often they get harassed by the players and by the coaches and by the PR people. It is systemic in the world of professional sports, and yet a lot of them are afraid to speak up, because if you speak up, you lose that coveted job, you lose getting access to the players. So people stay quiet still in so many other arenas.
You bring up, and I've heard everybody kind of mention this. It seems to me that if you become a victim, you're a victim twice. Number one, you're a victim of the actions or the words of the incident, and then you become a victim again because you're afraid to do something about what happened to you in the first place. Am I hearing that right?
And in some cultures, the actual action that is taken is against that victim. So it isn't just that maybe the person who's abusing you. To your point about it being something that is pervasive throughout society, that person who speaks up gets victimized again because now they're the person who dressed provocatively, or they're the person, what did you do to invite it, as you were talking about earlier. So now they're being shamed, to your point, in front of their peers. Their peers won't talk to them, they won't have lunch with them, because now you're the pariah, because you're the one who spoke out.
And one of the things we know from looking at social psychology literature, which is really, it's not my direct field, but it's really very interesting, is people don't like complainers, period. Even if they think what they complained about was unjust and they think the complaint was valid, right? If you complain about race discrimination and the survey participant will say, I think there was race discrimination and I still don't like that person complained about it. So it is, you're sort of stuck, right? There is a catch-22. And what we know from sexual harassment specifically is retaliation in formal ways, right? You lose your job, you get demoted, you get put on the night shift, you know, your desk gets moved, you get ostracized. Over 50% of the people who file an internal harassment complaint will suffer some form of retaliation. So women historically have been sort of good at doing the cost-benefit analysis and mostly deciding not to complain because they see that, right? They see that my life is not going to get better. Now, whether this moment is going to change that, I don't know, right? But we have to think about what's historically stopped people from complaining.
Yeah, because you're afraid you're going to get blackballed. Like, for instance, I have talked to almost every single female reporter in our newsroom, and throughout their entire careers, they have been sexually harassed, but nobody wants to say anything because then you're like, I'm not going to get that promotion to the network, or I'm not going to get promotion to the next market because I'm going to be blackballed because I complained against the boss or against the photographer or against whoever it was that was doing it. And it's been very frustrating. So this is, for me, a huge watershed moment. I mean, I remember personally, my first job, my first news director, I would walk in his office, he'd be like, oh, you look erotic and green. And then we had another news director and another mark, he'd come up and he'd start massaging our shoulders, and and so you just kind of sat there and took it. But you were afraid to speak up or go and complain to the general manager because typically they would be out golfing together or they're buddies, and so you're stuck afraid to say anything. And so I personally kept silent for years about stuff that has happened in my career, and I kind of now wish that I do wish that I had spoken up, that I had been more courageous at the time. So it takes courage to do what these women are doing, to come out against powerful men like Matt Lauer and others that are so popular. It's a courageous thing to do, and I have to admit I didn't have the courage to do it early on in my career.
That's even more so if you look at the stories about Harvey Weinstein. He had, with hiring a firm, spending hundreds of thousands of dollars doing Oppo research on his potential accusers, right? He was ready for war, and no, that's not what everybody's doing because they can't afford it, and maybe they're not that devious, but to have to face not only the fact that you might not be believed or you might be called a liar, but that you might face this like full frontal assault into your life and your past is very daunting. I think it's more than just courage. I mean, you really, it's beyond that.
It also goes to, you were talking about within an industry, it follows you, because who is it that future employer is going to contact about you but your past employer? So it's not just in the current situation, so they may quit a job where they feel uncomfortable, but that reputation of being a complainer, to your point, follows you. And so it makes future employment and promotions much more difficult as well. It's not a one-time thing.
Well, do you think that there's, I realize this is a watershed moment, is there something in terms of the media discussion of this issue now that we in the media are missing? Is there something that you think that the public needs to be aware of that really hasn't come out in this story yet?
I think the number one thing is how to prevent it. So you don't hear a lot of discussion about that. This is not something that we as a society just have to accept and put up with. Yes, it is something that we have accepted and put up with for a very long time, but this is an opportunity for change. And I think that the way to change it is awareness, first of all, consequences, to your point, holding people accountable for their actions, and training people on what to do and what not to do, so that there isn't this fear of having an interaction with someone of the opposite sex. People people in the workplace have to work collaboratively. It doesn't mean that they can't do that without sexual harassment. They absolutely can. And I think that message needs to be going out to everyone in all of the different industries that are being touched. And I haven't heard a lot of that.
And I just hope that that we talk about this like we do other things like domestic violence or shootings, and then we just move on, because we all remember what happened to Anita Hill, so that was big, and everybody talked about sexual harassment then, and then it's like, it just kind of went away, and now we have another moment where we have an opportunity to get it right. And I just hope that we continue to move forward and not stagnate like we do on so many other issues.
You concerned this has become too politicized? And by that I mean too many people pointing fingers when they see someone on their own team and something has happened. They have a different reason why that's okay. So that's what I mean. This is really, to me, a moral issue as opposed to a political issue, but it seems to me that it keeps getting discussed as something that's political.
Yeah, I think the allegations against the politicians, there have been several, does sort of mess it up for the whole conversation, because people do end up parsing these lines of, well, she was 14, but that's really old and she looked old. Nobody really believes that was okay, right? But I think for me, and I don't think it's really the media getting it wrong necessarily, I think it's the whole conversation is perpetuating some of the myths, right? So, for example, the fact that all of them, these famous men, get all this airtime to say they're all liars, 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 right? And there's very little talk about the fact that we actually study the rate of false allegations, right? There are studies looking at the rate of false rape allegations, right? There's a very strong narrative that women lie about rape. All the studies show it's a tiny, tiny number, 1 to 3% best case scenario in terms of false allegations. That doesn't get out there. We also have this sort of narrative that it's really that harassment is the product of the bad guy, that there's this one bad actor, and if we could just get rid of him, if we could just get rid of Harvey Weinstein, which really obscures how much it's the culture of an institution, of society as a whole, but also a particular institution. Some employers, some institutions really do pretty well, and it's about how their culture is and what they accept and what they don't accept. And so this is not just a problem of bad actors. If we could just fire all the bad actors and replace them with better actors, you're just going to get more people who get put in the same position where they are given the message that they're entitled to behave however they want. And so you have to change the structure. And so, like I said, I don't think it's really the media's fault, but I think that sort of story is a bad myth about harassment.
I've got two questions I want to get to. Heather's asking, or she's saying rather, she was forced to resign after reporting it at work. So we talked a little bit about the evidence, and now with smartphones, just record everything. She said she went to the police right after it happened and everything, but the evidence was not enough for the police and she lost her job. She says, I wish I stayed silent. So is there any sort of advice you can give? How much is enough and how much is too much? I guess there's no such thing as too much, but what could she have done?
Every situation is different,
Yeah.
And the one thing that I'm assuming that this was in an employer within a corporate setting. Somebody always has a boss, so the boss's boss. Talk to the boss's boss, or talk to the chairman of the board of directors, or whomever. Escalating these kinds of problems and not letting them go under the rug is really the only recourse for someone who's in that situation. She's already threatened. She's already going to lose her job. She's already gone to the police and has not found help there. The best thing that a person can do in that situation, in addition to pulling their HR department in with them, which they should do first and foremost, but try the escalation process. That's the best advice that I would have.
Yeah. And
also, sometimes it's helpful to, if you can, to talk to a lawyer before you complain and get a sense both of the risks and benefits of doing it, but also what's the best way to do it. Who's the best person to contact? What's the best way to present it? The police, it's sort of an X factor, right? You can bring it to them. They have 1,000 different points of discretion where they decide they want to go forward or they don't want to go forward, and you have no control over that process. They don't owe you anything, right? The employer there are rules of employer liability, there are anti-discrimination rules, and it's possible that a lawyer coming in earlier, even though that's not practical for a lot of people, might help. But the truth is, sometimes that's going to be the way it goes, and going to social media, finding other victims, figuring out and moving to a place that's not going to treat her like that. But there's not always a happy ending, and that's, I think, an unfortunate truth. We see all these men getting fired right now, and it feels like every complainant's going to be vindicated, and that is not the reality for most people.
There are a lot of advocacy groups too that they could turn to, like the Rape Crisis Center, and they do a wonderful job of helping women navigate through the process and how to make your case stronger. I mean, if I felt like something had happened and I felt that I had been assaulted, that would be one of the first calls I would make, is to the Rape Crisis Center, because they can guide you on how to preserve the evidence, how to get everything that you need to present to the police as well.
Yeah, and that brings me to my next question, which, Rebecca, you answered flawlessly. Where can victims of abuse go, and what other places, I guess? So let's say this wasn't a rape or an abuse situation in that realm. Where are other resources available besides social media? I mean, I know now that's the first place everyone thinks, let me just tweet this out and get some support, but where else can people go?
So people can go, first of all, to the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. There's a regional office everywhere. But that's, and if this woman that asked the prior question complained and got fired, that is something to go to the EEOC about. Retaliation is an independent cause of action under federal anti-discrimination law and most state laws. And in fact, much easier to win. The win rate in retaliation claims, the evidence usually works better. Juries are more willing to infer retaliation than they are discrimination in the first place, which is sort of a weird thing. But so she might still, I don't know what the timing is, but she might still do that. There's a statute of limitations. But the EEOC is always a place to start, and you don't have to have a lawyer to go talk to them, and they will help you figure out what to do. But yeah, there are great advocacy groups that, depending on what city you're in and what kind of situation you're in, the internet is a great tool. If you just Google, help with sexual harassment, you'll see who the major players are and who the actors are, and they all have toolkits and fact sheets and referrals. You can go to your local bar association to get attorney referrals. So you are not alone. It is not pleasant, but you are not alone.
There also is an opportunity for them to look at associations that they may belong to, so a professional organization, and also in today's world of matrixed organizations, typically if you have a corporate, like a parent company, and there are subsidiaries, you can reach out to someone else in a different subsidiary and have conversation. So is this something that happens in your workplace? Because this is what happens in ours. So maybe that's an opportunity also to find strength in numbers, or to show the dichotomy between the two. So this isn't the way this culture operates in the same branch of the same company, and mine does. So parent company, do something about that.
Right.
All right, excellent. So it looks like we've given people some options, hopefully. Professional organizations, the EEOC, also your local bar association. So it is a mistake to believe that just because someone is not listening to you where you work, that this problem simply is just not going to be solved. There are some opportunities, I believe, that are available to other folks. Also, I might add, and Rebecca, you'll probably back me up on this, people in the media are always very interested in seeing stories that are well documented.
I was just going to say that. A lot of times, call a reporter, call a news station. And we've done a lot of stories like that where people have not been heard or feel like they have been disenfranchised. And so they call us and we do the story. A lot of my stories have been done that way.
Thank you very much. Jonna Grossman, appreciate you very much. Beth Jones, appreciate you. Of course, Alicia, appreciate you. And Rebecca, appreciate you. We do appreciate your being with us today. This clearly is, tomorrow, who knows what's going to happen tomorrow, who it will be tomorrow. But the problem will be with us. It will continue to be with us until everybody where you work, male and female, makes a decision that this needs to go away or be changed in some form or fashion. Appreciate you joining with us today, and if you've got some ideas for some stories for us, you can always contact us. You get me at jmckay@wfaa.com, a weird last name, jmccaa@wfaa.com, or of course Rebecca, you can get at rlopez, rlopez @wfaa.com. And again, we're always looking for stories. Thanks very much.